Chapter 3, Part 2. Umar. Like Abu Bakr, Umar was an early convert to Islam. He accepted the religion at the hands of the Prophet in Mecca before the Hijrah, and was with him at all the major battles and events in Medina. There could be no doubting his credentials to lead the Muslim state, and based on Islamic tradition, there appears to have been no disagreement regarding his succession to office. This kind of stability in governance and succession would be sorely missed later in Islamic history. Unlike Abu Bakr, Umar did not have to deal with questions of political stability or the continuity of the religion. The entire Arabian Peninsula was united under his command. The massive military effort that spread throughout the peninsula in the wars of apostasy gave the Muslim state the confidence and skills to begin thinking seriously about territorial expansion to the north. Furthermore, the traditional Arab way of life that was confined to the Arabian Peninsula was no longer feasible. For centuries, Arabs had survived through the continual raiding of rival tribes and the subsequent spoils of war. Now that the vast majority of Arabia was Muslim, such raids on neighboring tribes meant contravening Islamic law. The Prophet had spoken on numerous occasions about the entire Muslim population being one ummah, or nation. It was inconceivable that that nation would go on through history in constant conflict with itself. Partly to remove chances of inter-Islamic conflict, and partly to provide security to the few Arab tribes that were converting to Islam within Byzantine and Sassanid borders. The Muslim armies turned north, where their greatest conquests would come. Raids into Sassanid-controlled Mesopotamia already began during the last year of Abu Bakr's life, and continued once Umar took power. At first, Umar and other leading Muslims probably did not foresee these raids turning into permanent conquests. But a devastating war between the Byzantines and Sassanids that lasted from 603 to 628 left the imperial powers weak and unable to hold off waves of Arab Muslims arriving at their borders. The fertile lands of Mesopotamia and Syria were ready to fall. All that was needed was an organized assault by the Muslims. This would be a new type of war, however. Unlike the campaigns of destruction that the two empires had waged, the Muslim calls for war were combined with the calls for justice and social harmony consistent with the message of Muhammad. When Abu Bakr sent out the first armies, he ordered his forces to secure the safety of women, children and the elderly, to leave monks in their monasteries unmolested, and even to refrain from destroying crops. These rules could not have been more different from what the Arabs engaging in these conquests were used to before Islam. But Muhammad's movement had been revolutionary from the start. Old ideas, traditions and ways of life had to give way to a new order, and that extended to warfare. Armies were simultaneously sent into Syria and Mesopotamia in 633. Khalid ibn al-Walid, fresh off his victories in the wars of apostasy, led the detachment headed towards the Persians. Meanwhile, Yazid, the son of Abu Sufyan, led the armies sent to Syria, where he quickly managed to defeat a Byzantine force near Gaza. For the Byzantines, the surprising loss indicated this could turn out to be not a routine raid, but a full-scale invasion. Emperor Heraclius ordered the imperial army to mobilize and prepare to crush the Arabs before they were able to consolidate their victory. The Medina government was aware that this was a possibility, and Khalid was ordered to immediately leave Iraq, where he had already had some success, and travel across the waterless Syrian desert to reinforce the armies there. The combined Muslim forces met the Byzantines at the Battle of Ajanade about 30 kilometers west of Jerusalem, where the Muslim armies completely routed the imperial force under the command of the emperor's own brother. The remaining Byzantine troops in southern Syria retreated to the well-fortified cities of Jerusalem, Caesarea and Gaza, leaving the victorious Muslims free to roam the countryside of Palestine. The Muslim armies under the command of Khalid moved north and laid siege to the ancient city of Damascus, which fell in September 635. The treaty he forged after the city capitulated was intended to allay the fears of the locals. In it, Umar promised that their lives, property and religion would be safeguarded from any harassment, so long as a tribute to the Muslim government was paid. This set the tone for the fighting, that it was aimed at the Byzantine government and army, not the civilians. With such guarantees, there would be a much lower chance of rebellions by the Syrian population, which was essential considering that a relatively small Bedouin force was now beginning to occupy a large and diverse province in Syria. The loss of Damascus caused the Byzantine emperor to assemble an even larger force, with the hopes of sending the Arabs back into the deserts for good. Khalid knew his raiding force was no match for the bulk of the imperial army and decided to withdraw south, stalling the inevitable climactic battle between the two sides. Eventually, Heraclius' army caught up with the Muslim force at Yarmouk, along the border of present-day Jordan and Syria, in the summer of 636. The Byzantine force was much larger, better equipped and better trained. But morale was low as numerous rivalries and quarrels caused friction in the ranks. Taking advantage of this and the familiarity the Arabs had fighting in rough terrain, the Muslim force decisively defeated the Byzantines. The Byzantine army was chased off the battlefield and ceased to be an effective fighting force capable of any military action. Emperor Heraclius was forced to concede defeat in Syria, as he had neither the soldiers nor the money to hold off the Muslim invasion. Cities throughout Syria fell one by one, all of them given terms similar to the ones given to Damascus by Khalid ibn al-Walid. By 638, the conquest of Syria was complete. From there, the fight against the Byzantines continued in Egypt, which fell relatively quickly, by 642. Two of the Byzantine Empire's most valuable and prosperous regions had fallen into the hands of a people they had scarcely considered important enough to recognize before Islam. In 70 AD, the Roman Empire exiled Jews from Jerusalem. It was not until the Muslim conquest in 637 that they were allowed back to the Holy City. Within a few years, Syria had gone from a land firmly under the control of Byzantine Empire to a province of the growing Muslim Empire. For the victorious Muslims, the conquest must not have seemed that surprising. After all, they believed that God was on their side so long as they adhered to the religion that He sent down through Muhammad. The examples of Badr and the conquest of Mecca from the time of the Prophet proved to them that victory was possible in the face of overwhelming odds with God's help. For the Byzantines, the loss of Syria was simply the first domino to fall in the final decline of the successor to the Roman Empire. Imperial armies would never again march through Christianity's holy land, nor would they ever again reap the economic benefits of this fertile region. For the locals living in Syria, however, the Byzantine loss did not have much of an impact on daily life. Churches continued to operate, peasants farmed land, and trade caravans passed through as they had before. To help sort out the civil administration of the region, Umar personally traveled from Medina to Syria. One of his first actions in the country was to relieve Khalid ibn al-Walid of his post. This no doubt shocked everyone, including Khalid himself. Among the many possible reasons for forcing Khalid into retirement, Muslim historians in the past tended to settle on Umar's desire to remind the Muslim armies that God, not Khalid, was the reason for their victories. If the Muslims could sustain their streak of battlefield victories without one of the greatest generals of all time, it would serve as proof for those with weak faith of the divine guidance and help for their mission. When it came to governorship of the new province, Umar appointed Muawiyah, the son of the Meccan aristocrat Abu Sufyan. He hailed from the wealthy and powerful Umayyad family, which had a major role in the administration of Quraysh before Islam. That lineage of governance would serve Muawiyah well in turning Syria from a new province to the economic and political heart of the Muslim world over the next 20 years. While Umar was in Syria, he personally attended to the surrender of Jerusalem in 637. He was given a guided tour of the city by the Patriarch Sophronius, an Arab Christian who had risen to become one of the leading figures of the Greek Church in Jerusalem. The terms of the treaty that was signed with the leaders of Jerusalem was similar to others put in place throughout Syria. What is unique about the Muslim conquest here, however, is that the new governors of Jerusalem allowed Jews to come to the city to worship for the first time in over 500 years. Islamic scripture holds the Christian and Jewish religions in special esteem, calling them the people of the book. It would not have made sense in Islamic law to allow the Christians freedom to visit their holy sites in Jerusalem while upholding the Byzantine laws preventing Jews from doing so. This precedent of freedom and religious pluralism was based on Muhammad's constitution of Medina, which Umar was of course intricately familiar with. Yet while acknowledging the rights Christians and Jews had in Jerusalem, Umar was keen to send the message that this city also belonged to Islam. According to Islamic belief, this was the city to which Muhammad traveled in his miraculous night journey from Mecca, where he prayed on the site of the house of worship built by his fellow prophet Solomon and then ascended to heaven. There could be no minimizing the importance of Jerusalem in the Islamic tradition, and with this in mind, Umar set about cleaning the Temple Mount, which the Romans and then Byzantines had let fall into disuse. Upon the mount he erected the first version of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. After the fall of Syria, the attention of the Caliph went back to the Sassanid Empire, which had been mostly ignored since Khalid was ordered to move his armies to Syria. Umar appointed another veteran of Arab warfare who fought with the Prophet, Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, to lead the Muslim armies into Mesopotamia. Despite initial setbacks due to the Arab inability to deal with war elephants, Sa'd's army managed to defeat the Persians at the Battle of Qadisiyah in late 636. The battle saw significant spoils fall into Muslim hands, much of it forwarded to Medina for distribution according to Islamic law, and the temporary defeat of the Sassanid army. If the Muslims really wanted to hold Iraq, however, they would have to take Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital. Ctesiphon was not a well-defended city. It lay on the plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, about 60 kilometers north of the ancient city of Babylon. After a siege that lasted about 2 months, in early 637, the imperial city fell to the Muslim forces. The entire Tigris-Euphrates plain was now firmly under the control of the Muslim armies, with the Sassanid emperor and his government fleeing into the Persian highlands. Despite the string of impressive victories, Umar forbade his army from pursuing the Sassanids outside of Iraq. In Mesopotamia, the land was familiar enough to the Arab tribesmen that traditional military tactics proved useful. In the Iranian plateau, the Arabs would be unfamiliar with the terrain and could be decisively defeated. Furthermore, the native population there was entirely Persian, unlike in Iraq, and resistance from both the Sassanid army as well as the locals could be expected. The royal standard of the Sassanids was captured at Qadisiyah and taken to Medina. Rather than keep it as a symbol of Islam's victory over Persia, Umar ordered that it be destroyed and its jewels and gold be sold to feed the poor. Umar's time as caliph is noteworthy not just for his military conquests, but also his administration over conquered territories. One of the most impressive aspects of the conquests and subsequent incorporation of them into the Muslim empire was the fact that life barely changed for most inhabitants of the conquered lands. The Byzantine and Sassanid armies and aristocratic class left as the Muslims moved in, but the local populations remained untouched. There were only two main changes in the lives of the conquered people. The first was who they paid their taxes to. Whereas previously they had paid taxes to the governments in Constantinople and Ctesiphon, now they paid a tribute. In accordance with Islamic law, that was forwarded to Medina. In most cases, this tribute did not exceed the previous taxes and oftentimes was much less. For an everyday citizen, lower taxes are usually good news, regardless of who collects it. The second major change was the religious tolerance given to certain groups. Monophysite Christians, who differed from the ruling Greek Orthodox on matters of the nature of Christ, were allowed to practice their religion in Syria. A welcome change from the oppressive nature of the Byzantine government. Jews were similarly relieved of official oppression and were allowed to go back to their holiest city, Jerusalem, to worship. In the former Sassanid lands, Nestorian Christians saw increased religious freedom. As the ruling Zoroastrians had routinely restricted their freedoms on suspicions of being secretly allied with the Christian Byzantine Empire. Tensions of course still existed between religious groups, especially since the settled Christians of the Fertile Crescent probably resented the rule of nomadic Semites from the desert, but overall, the egalitarian nature of Muhammad's message helped usher in an era of religious tolerance that had mostly been absent in the Middle East previously. In economic terms, the conquests brought unimaginable wealth to the relatively simple Arabs. Thousands of silver and gold coins and valuable gems flowed from conquered lands, particularly Iraq, into Medina as part of the spoils of war. In keeping with the precepts of Islamic law, the spoils were considered to belong to the entire Muslim community and were divided among members of the Ummah. From the earliest converts to Islam to the newest non-Arabs to accept the religion. A huge boom in economic activity ensued in Mecca and Medina, with new houses being built regularly and huge estates being established to provide continued economic growth after the conquests ended. For the first time in Islamic history, immense wealth came into the hands of a Muslim government. Through 10 years as the Caliph of the Muslim world, Umar had taken the young Muslim state from a desert-based raiding society to a regional power. This rapid expansion coupled with social stability is proof of his incredible capabilities as an administrator and leader. And he has thus gone down as one of the most successful rulers in Islamic history. His reign came to a sudden end in 644 when he was murdered in Medina by a Persian slave who had a personal grudge against the charismatic leader. While on his deathbed, Umar appointed a council of 6 well-respected leaders of the community of Medina to choose his successor from among themselves. They chose Uthman bin Affan, another early convert to Islam, who unlike Abu Bakr and Umar came from the Umayyad clan of Mecca and was a very wealthy and powerful man before accepting Islam. No doubt seeing the success of Umar's policies, Uthman promised to follow in Umar's footsteps and uphold the same practices as the deceased caliph, which led to his appointment in late 644. Uthman's descent from an aristocratic family played a huge role in his decisions as caliph. The Umayyads had ample experience in administration dating back to the days before Islam, and Uthman relied on that experience in his personal decisions. His cousin Muawiyah was already the governor of Syria, and was doing an admirable job in transitioning that province from a frontier territory to the backbone of the Muslim state. Uthman proceeded to appoint his foster brother, Abdullah bin Saad, as governor of Egypt, hoping that Umayyad lineage would serve Egypt as well as it did Syria. Other cousins of his were appointed in Iraq, where they led raids into the Persian homeland, slowly conquering the rest of the Sassanid Empire. There were some allegations of nepotism for the first time in Islamic history, although they do not seem to have been serious enough to hamper the efforts and capabilities of the expanding Muslim state. During Uthman's caliphate, a Muslim embassy was sent to China to establish diplomatic relations between the caliphate and the Tang dynasty. Continuing in the footsteps of Umar and his emphasis on the military, Uthman ordered the construction of the first naval fleet in Muslim history, intended to thwart any Byzantine counterattacks. Governors in Syria and Egypt relied heavily on the expertise of the local Christians in building seafaring vessels. Christians who had formerly been under the sovereignty of the Byzantine Empire seem to have showed enthusiasm in their work for their new Arab governors, especially considering that many of them belonged to the Coptic Church and other Christian denominations that were not recognized by the Byzantines. The Muslims' willingness to treat them better than the Byzantines must have played a huge role in their loyalty to the caliphate. The result of this was peaceful civil society and security from external threats. As a Byzantine fleet attempting to recapture Alexandria in 646 was thwarted by Christian sailors in the employ of the caliphate. Besides simply defending its borders, the Muslim empire was able to expand its influence in the Mediterranean, capturing Cyprus and Crete, and raiding as far away as Sicily. Military success also continued on land, as Muawiyah led his powerful Syrian army into Armenia against Byzantine rule. The mountainous terrain of Anatolia, coupled with its mainly Greek population, meant a natural border between the Byzantines and the Muslims developed around the modern border of Turkey and Syria. Further east, Muslim armies continued to push into the Persian heartland under the command of another of Uthman's relatives, Abdullah bin Amir. The conquest of the rest of the Sassanid Empire was not as rapid as the conquest of Iraq. Here the society was more homogeneous and connected to the Sassanid government. As a result, the war exacted a heavier toll on the Muslim armies. Still, the completeness of the Muslim victory at Qadisiyah during the caliphate of Umar had essentially sealed the fate of the Sassanid Empire. It was simply a matter of time and effort to subdue the rest of the empire. Sassanid Emperor Yazdegerd was never able to fully replace the army he lost in 642, and over the following 10 years, the Sassanids were constantly on the defensive. By 650, the Iranian plateau was secured, and by 651, Khurasan was taken. That same year, the last Sassanid king was found while on the run and executed. Within a decade, the Muslim armies had pushed from Iraq to the river Oxus, reaching the edges of Central Asia. For Uthman, leading a rapid military expansion like Umar did not result in the same popularity as the second caliph. Trouble began to fester as discontent with his administrative policies, particularly his appointment of fellow Umayyads, began to take shape. Coupled with this, the slowing conquests meant less booty made its way into Medina, resulting in economic stagnation. Uthman's popularity was certainly not as high as his two predecessors, but it would be a stretch to assume a massive revolution was brewing that would remove him from power. Instead, it was a small band of soldiers who would bring violent and chaotic change to the Medinese government. In 656, a group of soldiers from Egypt came to Medina to protest directly to the caliph regarding his policies and the division of spoils between the army and the civil government in Egypt. He listened to both sides of the dispute and promised to take steps to solve the problems equitably. On their return to Egypt, the soldiers intercepted a letter supposedly written by the caliph to the governor of Egypt ordering their execution. They returned to Medina and besieged Uthman in his own house. Despite the mortal danger he was in, Uthman refused to order that the people of Medina arm themselves and fight the rebels, and even prevented his cousin Muawiyah from sending a force from Syria to protect him, lest blood be shed in the city of the Prophet. Many of the remaining companions of Muhammad opposed this mutiny, but were powerless to stop it. Martial law reigned in Medina, and its residents could only watch in horror as the rebels eventually forced their way into Uthman's house and murdered him as he sat reading his copy of the Quran. The caliph was dead, and with him so was the unity of the Muslim world.